Hate third grade. I couldn't wait. Chapter 27. Okay, it's called Torn in Two. Wait 1 second. My glasses are a little dirty. I'm just going to wipe them down a second before I start. Okay. Much better. Torn in Two. Amon started back up the shaft. I can't do it, he cried to himself. I can't do it. He'd overcome many things, but his fear of rats was so great that he couldn't tame it, even to save his father. I'm not really a man, he thought. A man would be strong enough to go on even though he's afraid. As Amon climbed toward the top of the shaft, he cried at his own weakness. But then he stopped. He hung his head in shame and in fear. It is not my courage that is weak, he decided. It's my faith. And with that, he prayed aloud. Jehovah, help me, he whispered into the dark. And from somewhere, Amon felt a bit of courage flow into his body. Taking a deep breath, Amon slowly climbed back down the shaft. Every time his foot would touch a rat or he'd hear a squeak in his ear, Amon would repeat the prayer, and each time a bit of supernatural courage would fill his heart and soul. A short time later, Amon reached the level of the cells and found the inside tunnel. And that's when he realized the pools far below were not for collecting rainwater, as those were under the temple. These were collecting sewage. Amon gagged at the stench and recoiled at the sight of rats filling the tunnel, but he was almost there and he wasn't about to give up. He maneuvered into the tunnel, bent low at the waist so as to not hit his head on the ceiling, and forced himself to wade forward through the ankle-deep sludge. Rats were all around. By now he barely even noticed them. All he cared about was getting to his father and getting out. Light shone through the first drain hole and came upon him, and Amon's heart started to pound. In moments he would see his father and rescue him from death. Amon had to bend even lower. His hair dipped into the sewage in order to see the cell on the other side. It was empty. Amon could see the torchlit passageway on the other side, the passageway he himself had walked through just a few days before. By moving back and forth, he could see from corner to corner in the cell, and he spotted an unused blanket. But the cell, it was empty. That's the one, he thought, and then he moved on to another cell. The second cell was empty also, and the third, and the fourth, empty, empty, empty. Amon reached the last cell, and it was empty. He leaned against the wall and silently screamed out his pain and frustration. Great sobs rose within him, sobs that he had to muffle and stifle and fight. His father was gone. And after all the investigations and planning and now climbing through sewage, his father was dead. Amon sobbed bitterly for several minutes, but was even numb with grief. His mind knew that he had to escape that horrible place and go home to be the father to his younger brothers. Just as he turned back to go the way he had come, Amon felt a sharp stab on his shin. He looked down and screamed. He knocked the rat away just as it was taking a second bite out of his leg. But he swung too hard, and that plunged the torch into the muck on the tunnel floor. The sewer tunnel went black. Unable to see now, and knowing he'd never get that torch relit, Amon pushed his way forward in the dark, swinging the dead torch like a club to knock any rats away in his path. He reached the vertical shaft and started climbing, knocking rats off the ledges that he needed for his fingers and his toes. He felt his way along until he reached the top of the shaft and climbed through the hole into the upper tunnel. I'll never find my way in the dark, he thought. Moments later, the ground started to shake. Amon screamed. In the blackness of the tunnel, he could see nothing and was thrown from side to side as the earthquake grew. He felt the bricks beneath his feet ripple in waves like water, and he felt the ceiling overhead dip and knock him in the head. Gaining power by the second, the earthquake grew, and it threw Amon to the ground, and then he heard bricks falling off the wall and the ceiling collapsing behind him in the direction he needed to go. Amon's head slammed against the rough bricks of the tunnel, and for a moment he saw the light of the stars. The light of stars. Pain sliced through his skull as if he was jabbed with a knife, and he felt blood running down his cheek. A thunderous crack. Amon's ears were boxed with the clap of air pressure. The ceiling on the other side of him collapsed with a roar. Then suddenly, it was still and quiet. Amon breathed hard and choked on the dusk, almost refusing to believe that he had survived such a thing. Light streamed down through the dust from a hole in the ceiling. It was daylight. As the dust began to settle, Amon saw that the tunnel through which he had originally climbed was completely blocked with rubble. But there was now a new escape, a hole in the ceiling. Climbing carefully over the jagged debris, Amon ascended toward the light. Dust filled his lungs, and he coughed continuously as he climbed out of the hole. Finally, he broke through and collapsed on the smooth, cool surface of a polished marble floor. He lay there for several minutes, catching his breath. Then he sat up and he looked around. He gasped. He was sitting in the middle of the temple itself, inside the holy place, with its altar of incense and table of shewbread. And at the other end of the holy place was the Holy of Holies, the place where God dwells on earth, the place no man can see without dying. He stared for a good long moment, wondering why he wasn't dead already, and then stared at the thick veil that was supposed to separate the Holy of Holies from the holy place, just so that men wouldn't accidentally look at the face of God and die. The veil was ripped in two. It hung loosely on either side of the Holy of Holies, revealing the place where God lives. Why aren't I dead? Amon wondered. And then he quickly turned around, shielding his eyes so as to not look at anything he should not see. Amon stood and headed straight for the tall double doors that would take him out of this dangerously sacred place. But just as he started to push on them, the doors suddenly opened on their own. Standing on the other side was a mob half the size of Jerusalem, led by Caiaphas and the rest of the priests. As one, the crowd slammed to a stop, staring at the devil emerging from the temple. Covered from head to toe with dust and grime and sludge, Amon looked like a creature from under the earth. As everyone stared at him, Amon squinted hard against the bright sunlight, his mouth hanging open. Caiaphas looked past Amon into the temple. He threw his hands up in front of his face to shield himself from the sight and yelled, "What have you done?" Then he turned to the 4 guards who had opened the doors and demanded, "Seize him!" 2 guards grabbed Amon by the arms, while 2 others hastily slammed the doors to the temple shut. Amon had screamed when he saw the inside of the temple. People had screamed when they saw the inside of the temple, and many began weeping and tearing their clothes for the destruction that they had witnessed. Amon was dragged through the crowd. Many spat on him, cursed him, and called him foul names. Then, just as he was being hauled through the court of women, Amon heard his name. "Amon!" came the voice again, and he searched and he found the source. Tamar was jumping up from behind people, waving to get his attention, and she was crying, "Amon!" Tamar shouted again and sounded like a cart crashing into a wall. "They killed him!" She wailed, and Amon, in shock, stopped fighting against the guards. "They crucified him!" Tamar cried, collapsing in tears. "No!" Amon screamed. Sobbing, Amon's body went limp, and the guards hauled him away to prison. The guards threw water on Amon to clean him up, more so they wouldn't have to smell him than out of any kindness to him. Amon didn't care. He was chained to a cell of the prison in the basement of the palace of Caiaphas, under an archway, by his arms and charged with desecration of the temple. Once he had been chained there. Others had been chained there, he could see, and very recently. Fresh blood covered the pavement and covered his feet. On the wall hung a whip with many tails, bits of metal and sharp stone woven into its leather. Amon wondered without passion how a whipping would feel. Though his body throbbed with pain and his tongue was thick with thirst, Amon felt nothing. "He's dead," Tabitha had screamed. "They crucified him." Then, as the guards were dragging him out of the court of women, Benjamin was running beside him, sobbing. "They killed Jesus," he cried, "and 2 thieves with him." And the 2 thieves with him. Images of the empty cells Amon had seen had flashed through his mind, images that would be burned there for all time. But it was the muttering comment of one of the guards that crushed Amon's heart completely. "One of those thieves was a good man," the guard said. Other images Amon visualized on his own, images of 3 men on crosses, dying, one of them his father, the other a false Messiah. Jesus wasn't the Messiah after all. That realization hit Amon almost as hard as the news of his father's death. His father's fate had always been a possibility, and he was somewhat prepared for it. But Jesus had died a failure, an imposter. It was a shock to him. "I really believed in him," Amon sobbed. "I was really convinced that he was the one. What a fool I am." And those were the thoughts that kept him company through the long, cold night. But they did not go away in the warmth of the day. And now the next morning, Amon knew that they would stay with him the rest of his life, however short it might be. His arms had gone numb by now. The bolts of pain in his shoulder returned only when he tried to move. Footsteps echoed up the corridor, and Amon looked up. Shadows crossed the small window in the wooden door to his cell, then came back and stopped. He heard the scraping of a key in the lock and gulped. Now the whipping would start, and Amon doubted that he'd live through it. No matter, he thought, "I will not face my fate as a child. I will face it as a man." He pulled his head straight up, threw his shoulders back as best he could, hanging as he was, and glared at the door as it swung open. 2 huge temple guards entered, both with arms as thick as trees. This would be particularly savage beating, he thought. Behind the 2 guards was an officer, and Amon realized with a start that it was Raphu, the captain he had interrogated. A 4th man entered. This one was wearing white robes. Shadows covered the man's face for several moments, but when he moved into the light, Amon saw that it was Neri, scribe to Caiaphas. The cell was becoming crowded by then, but still 2 more figures entered. "Gamaliel!" Amon gasped, and behind him, Joseph of Arimathea. Amon's teacher looked distressed. "Get him down from there," he barked. Raphu nodded to the other guards, who released Amon's wrists from their shackles. Amon collapsed to the ground, unable to stand or even hold himself up. Gamaliel, Joseph, Neri, and Raphu all rushed to his side. "Water!" Raphu commanded, and the guards held out a skin of water. Gamaliel grabbed the water from Raphu and slowly dribbled it into Amon's mouth. Amon lapped up the water desperately. "Slow down," Gamaliel said. "Allow your body to recover at its own pace." Soon Amon felt his strength returning, and he sat up. What happened?" he asked. The 4 adults looked at each other. Then Neri spoke. "Caiaphas has already ordered you beaten to death," the scribe said. "I reminded him that Pilate forbade him from executing anyone, but he just screamed, and he said he cared not what Pilate thought. He was going to see you dead for desecrating the temple. After all that's happened," Neri concluded, "he wanted to see someone pay for it." "What's happened?" Amon asked. Joseph leaned in and spoke for the first time. "The city is in chaos. The moment Jesus died, the sky grew dark and the earthquake started. It seemed to last an eternity," he whispered, closing his eyes. "People are even reporting that graves opened," Gamaliel added, "and the dead were rising." Amon stared at the 2 mentors, trying to understand. "Everyone has seen the temple swaying," Joseph continued, "and they ran to see if it was damaged. That's when you came out of the doors." and we could see that the veil had been torn in two. Amon, now remembering his experience, asked, "Why am I not dead? I saw the Holy of Holies." "As we all did," Gamaliel said. "I don't know why the finger of God spared us." Amon nodded, thinking then, "What of my father?" Joseph shook his head. "After the executions, I went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus to bury it in my tomb. But the Romans had already taken down the bodies of the others and thrown them in a common grave. For the first time since entering the tunnels the day before, Amon acted like a child again. He buried his head in Gamaliel's chest and cried for his father. "Come now," Raphu said a few minutes later. "We must go before Caiaphas changes his mind." Gamaliel and Joseph supported Amon between them and headed out of prison. On the way, Amon recovered enough to ask, "How is it I am being freed?" Joseph and Gamaliel looked at each other, but it was Neri who answered, "Your two friends here challenged Caiaphas in front of the entire Sanhedrin." Amon looked in shock as his two mentors, who simply shrugged. "Caiaphas was in the middle of sentencing you to death," Neri continued, "blaming you for the torn veil." Then Gamaliel stood up and roared, "You would satisfy your anger with the blood of a boy?" At the word boy, Amon looked sharply at his teacher. Gamaliel shrugged and said, "Sometimes we must use the words which will persuade." Amon nodded. Then Joseph stood. Neri added, and he said, "If you kill this boy, Caiaphas, I will demand a closer investigation into the theft of which his father is accused." That brought the whole Sanhedrin into an uproar, and soon your release was ordered. Amon looked first at Gamaliel and then to Joseph and said, "My family will be forever in your debt." He tried to bow, but in his weakness, he only stumbled. By now they had reached the door of the prison, and Raphu opened it with a large key. Sunlight knocked Amon backwards, but his two friends held him steady. Raphu and Neri stayed behind, and Gamaliel and Joseph walked Amon through the streets of Jerusalem to his home. They stopped at a pool on the way to bathe the stench off of Amon. "The disciples of Jesus have all disappeared," Gamaliel said, and Amon washed his hair. "They fear retribution from Caiaphas, as well they should." "Judas," Amon said, suddenly remembering. "Judas betrayed Jesus. I was there and I saw it with my own eyes." Gamaliel nodded. "Yes, it is so," he said. "After Jesus was crucified, Judas was overcome with guilt. He threw his blood money at the priests in the temple and then went out and hanged himself." Amon thought about this as his two mentors dressed him in a new tunic and led him up the street. He was weary of all the death and deceptions, but his heart soared when they turned the corner and he saw his house. When he walked through the door, Tabitha screamed and rushed to her son. "I thought I had lost you too," Tabitha cried as they hugged. She thanked the two men and followed two men. Then Amon followed them outside. Joseph left, and Gamaliel turned to go, but Amon stopped him. I cannot think of a proper word with which to thank you," he said. "You have saved my life." Gamaliel shook his head violently. "No," he said, "I am a coward. I stood back and watched these last weeks as Caiaphas used his office for shame and treachery. But you," he said, taking Amon's chin in his hand, "you fought like a man with the courage of a warrior. You didn't give up, and you put your own life in jeopardy for the ones you loved and the things you believed in, Amon." Gamaliel said quiet, "In this matter, you have been my mentor." Amon stared at his teacher for a moment, then bowed in acceptance of the compliment. Back inside the house, Amon, his mother, and his brothers spent most of the afternoon mourning the death of their father and husband. "I trust in Jehovah," Tabitha kept saying. "He will care for us no matter what." After a time, Tabitha told Amon he should go upstairs. He did as his mother suggested and found there were 5 of Jesus' disciples, including Peter. The disciples were sitting on the floor in the shadows around the edges of the room. They had the windows covered, and every one of them looked half dead. Amon and Tamar greeted in dark whispers, and he asked her then what was going on. "They fear for their lives," she said. "Now that Jesus is gone, they think the temple guards will be after them next." And, she added, they are devastated that Tamar couldn't finish her sentence. So Amon did it for her, that Jesus was a false prophet. Tamar hung her head but didn't say anything. Amon looked around the room at the disciples. It is understandable, he said. The man was very convincing. He even fooled me for a time. Amon waited for several moments, but Tamar didn't say anything. So he turned to go. He could still be the Messiah, Tamar said softly. Amon spun around, surprised by her words. What did you say? I said maybe Jesus really is the Messiah. Amon looked at his friend as if she were claiming to be the Messiah herself. How could you say such a thing, he hissed, not wanting to raise his voice in the den of sorrow. When I think of everything I heard him say and everything I saw him do, I just think maybe, Tamar, Amon whispered, becoming almost angry with her. Jesus is dead. He couldn't have saved my father. He couldn't save himself. How could he be the savior of the world? Tamar turned to her father for help, but Bartholomew turned away, his hollow eyes showing no emotion. Believe what you want, Amon said finally with a shake of his head, but Jesus is dead, and he's not coming back to life. Tamar opened her mouth as if to speak, but Amon turned and began climbing the ladder to the roof, wanting to see his bed and all his belongings neatly in order, everything in its place, as if life had not been chaos. At a moment there was a loud pounding at the door. The disciples jumped in panic. Each pulled farther back into the shadows as if they could hide from the temple guards. Amon raced down the stairs in time to see his mother open the front door. Filling the door were 2 Roman centurions, so large that they blocked the sunlight behind them. Is this the house of Amon, son of Jotham? One of them demanded. Tabitha nodded her head. Then may we enter? The Roman continued more softly. I need the help of a friend. The 2 centurions stepped inside the house, and Amon recognized Cornelius. You are most welcome, my friend, he said, and jumped down the last few steps. But then he recognized the second Roman and skidded to a stop, staring. It was the centurion that had taunted him at the fortress that night he visited Cornelius. What's he doing here? He spat out. This is Titus, Cornelius said. He had a strange experience this afternoon, and now I must find a place to hide him. What kind of experience? Tabitha said. Now that he looked at him closely, Amon realized that Titus seemed to be a mummy, a word Amon and his friends used to describe someone whose body was there but mind was not there. He was in charge of the crucifixion of Jesus, Cornelius said. Amon and Tabitha looked at each other. If the men upstairs heard this, there would surely be a riot in the house. And how can we help him? Tabitha asked, sounding like she really didn't want to. Cornelius sat his comrade at the table and answered. Before the crucifixion, Titus was as annoying and obnoxious as ever. Was as annoying and obnoxious as ever. But after Jesus died, he fell to his knees in front of the entire squad and started crying. Amon looked at Cornelius in amazement. He kept repeating over and over, surely this was the Son of God. His men were ready to turn him over to our commander, Cornelius finished, so I put them to work burying the rest of the criminals and took him home. But now I must find a place to hide him. Amon and Tabitha were silent for a long moment. Did he execute anyone else today? Cornelius was confused for a moment, then understanding crossed his face and his eyes grew wide. No, Amon, not your father. Oh, I get it. Understanding crossed his face and his eyes grew wide. No, Amon, not your father. Tears were streaming down Amon's face and he fought the desire to kill Titus. No, not at all, Cornelius said quickly. He was on a special duty today for just that one. Suddenly, a loud wail erupted from inside the mummy. I killed him, Titus moaned, rocking back and forth. I killed the Son of God. Titus buried his head in his hands and sobbed as Cornelius tried to comfort him. Amon was amazed at the power of a false prophet who could make a Roman soldier behave like this. Of course he may stay here, Tabitha said, and Amon looked at her surprised. Any man who humbles himself before God is welcome in this house, she added, with a look at her son. Thank you, Cornelius said. I must return to my garrison and help them search for Titus. My commander believes he's deserted his post and fled the city. I must help him continue to believe this." Cornelius turned to go, but then stopped and turned back. "I am truly sorry about your father, Amon," he said, "and about your Messiah." Amon nodded his thanks, and Cornelius slipped out into the night. Tabitha removed Titus's armor as her son stood and watched. Amon turned and climbed back up the stairs. He passed through the upper room where the disciples and Tamar mourned in silence, and went up to the roof where his 2 brothers lay on their beds, exhausted from their grieving. As Amon lay down on his own bed, the events of the last 2 days swam before his eyes, such that he could think of nothing else. Hours later, as sleep finally began to take over his exhausted mind and tortured body, his last conscious thought was one of the prophecies. Here's the after part. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Matthew 27:51. Is there sin in your life which has separated you from God? Is there any hidden, unrepented of selfishness that keeps you from really knowing him? Jesus' death on the cross was not just a symbolic act. It was a real payment for our real sins. And when that payment was complete, the veil that stood between us and God for centuries was ripped down the middle. Is there sin in your life? The power of forgiveness is available today, as it was the moment Jesus died on the cross. All you have to do is ask, and when you do, the veil that is separating you from God will be torn in two. There are moments in all of our lives when we feel lost, unforgiven, and unforgivable, unloved and abandoned. The disciples felt that way on the Saturday night. Everything they'd believed in, hoped for, was gone. To their minds, there would be no grace, no mercy, no future. You know the end of the story, of course, but do you know the end of your own story? Will there be a time of spiritual resurrection in your life? Or will you choose to live on Saturday with its pain, disappointment, and despair? Throughout this story, you've seen Amon grow and change. The question is, have you?